Welcome to Mystery Bible. My name is Ken Primus. I'm your host. We have been studying Abraham's life, and we will be continuing doing that for a little while because there's so much in this man's life. Before we saw him in Genesis 12, but we've covered some of that. He's now age 76, and we're still here. I think this is our second podcast around this age, and we're going to continue. We talked about his time in Egypt and why he went there because of the famine. We talked about Sarai, and before the Pharaoh, the first Pharaoh, and what happened there. We talked about how Pharaoh gave Sarai, Hagar, his daughter, as her handmaid. We also talked about Lot, the last episode of Lot, and the strife that took place between Lot and Abram, and when they split up and the reasons behind them splitting up. We also talked about the fact that when Lot left, he not just left Abram, he also left God. He turned his back on God and he left, and they separated. We talked about a little about the Pharaoh, how the first Pharaoh came to be. And so we are going to look at pick up from there. We're going to talk about Abram rescuing Lot and what happened with the kings, the 5 kings, and we'll just go from there. We're also going to, let me just do a quick recap. We know in the first covenant was in Genesis 12, 4, that is in the Bible. That's when when God came to him in Genesis 12, 1, 3. We know that he passed through the land of Canaan in Genesis 12, 6. He went into Egypt, Genesis 12, 6. Returned from Egypt. He's in Bethel right now in Genesis 13, 1 through 4. And Genesis 13, 5 through 18 is his separation from Lot. Genesis 14, 1 to 24 is his battle with the 5 kings. We're going to pick up there today after this message. Welcome back to Mystery Bible. We're going to continue our study. So Abraham is now 78 years old when he rescues Lot. So they are separated. 2 years had passed. He's now 78 years old, and we're going to pick up on that war that took place amongst the kings. But I wanted to go back and just briefly look at a few things that I'd mentioned earlier. I want to look in the 13th chapter of Genesis and remind you guys about a couple of things. In 13:13, we see it makes a statement, and it's a brief little statement that the Bible does. It says, "But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinners before the Lord." And we are going to do a study on Sodom and Gomorrah, but we're going to wait until chapter 19 when God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah, and then you'll understand why God did what he did. Okay, the next piece that we're going to do is the blessing. I had mentioned to you guys about the blessing. I want to wait on that because I wanted you to see that it goes through this family. And when it gets to Isaac and Jacob and all of these things, I want you guys to see the manifestation of it. There's a drama happening with Esau there and the blessing, and we're going to study the blessing there because it's really critical that we understand what that is. Also, another piece of this that we're going to do, another sidebar, is at the birth of the promised son that God had given to the promise that he had given to Abram Abram and Sarai. I want you also to let's do a quick look at the end of chapter 13. Abram moved to Hebron. It says, "And the Lord said to Abram after that Lot was separated from him, lift up your eyes now and look from the place where you are northwards, southwards, eastward, and westward. For all the land which thou seest, to thee I will give it, and to thy seed forever. And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if any man can count the dust of the earth, then they shall be able to count your seed. Arise, walk through the land in the length and in the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee." Then Abram removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mer, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord. So that's what's going on in his life. In Lot's life, a lot of different things. As I mentioned to you, Lot had walked away from God. Now we're going to pick up chapter 14. "And it came to pass in the days of Arioch, king of Elmsar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations." Now, the king of Amraphel, he is Nimrod. That's Nimrod. So Nimrod is in servitude to Chedorlaomer. This was one of his generals that after the fall of the tower, that this general he took over and he became, I guess, his king in a way. So we see that, and he went and spread out to different areas. But now Nimrod is in servant with him, and Nimrod is a part of this group. And these made war with Barah, king of Sodom, and with Barsha, king of Gomorrah, Sinab, king of Admar, and Shebera, king of Zeboim, the king of Bela, which is Zoar. And these were joined together in the vale in Siddim, which is the salt sea. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th they rebelled. And in the 14th year came Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him and smote the Rephaim. These are giants, guys. And this is, again, I told you about the birth of the giants. So this is a giant war that is going on there in Ashraf, Kazumim, and in Zuz, Zirum in Ham, and in in Shevat. These were, and I apologize for this, the Horites in the Mount of Seri unto El Pharan, which is by the wilderness. And they returned and came to Ephrath, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country, and the Amalekites, and also the Amorites that dwelt in Hezron Tamar. And they went out of the kings of Sodom, and the kings of Gomorrah, and the kings of Admar, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, the same is Zoar, and they joined battle with them in the vale of Siddim, with Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, with the king of Tidal, king of nations, Amraphel, king of Sinar, and Enoch, king of Elsar. 4 kings with 5. And the vale of the Siddim was full of slime pit, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there, and they remained fled to the mountains. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their victual, and went their way. And they took Lot, Abraham's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mer, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and brother of Anar, and these were the confederates of Abram. And when Abram heard that this brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. And he divided himself against them, he and his servants, by night, and smote them and pursued them unto Hebron, which is the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and also again his brother Lot, and his people, and the women also, and the people. So we see that this war, as a result, and I apologize for butchering the language, guys, I really do. But we see that this war has taken place, and the result of this war is that Sodom and Gomorrah is captured, and they took them as spoils of war, as they say. And as spoils of war, they kept their men, the women, children, and so forth, and they tried and they took off. And as they embarked on, their conquest, news got to Abram as to what happened. And so when Abraham found that out, he took over, and he went and he rescued his son, his brother's son. And we see that this is one of the first battles of the Nephilims. These are giants, and Abram and his men went and took over and beat these guys. So we're going to take a look now, and we're going to pick up some things in the book of Yasher and see how they recorded the battle. And we're going to pick up when Abram heard. He says, and Abram heard this, and he arose and went about 318 men that were with him, and he that night pursued the kings and smote them, and they all fell before Abram and his men, and there was none remaining but the 4 kings who fled, and they went each his own road. And Abram recovered all the property of Sodom, and he also recovered Lot, and his property, his wives, and little ones, and all that belonging to him, so that Lot lacked nothing. And when he returned from smiting these kings, he and his men passed the valley of Siddim, where the kings had made war together. And Barak, king of Sodom, and the rest of men, and they were with him, went out from the lime pit into which they had fallen to meet Abram and his men. And we see that he now encounters Melchizedek. And Melchizedek, king of Jerusalem, the same was Shem, went out with his men to meet Abram and his people, and bread and wine, and they remained together in the valley of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek blessed Abram, and Abram gave him a tenth. So we see that after this war, that there was a separation of the lot, as they say back then, that these men wanted. Let me just read it, and so you could see what happened, what took place. And so, and after he meets Melchizedek. So, and all the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah were there with their servants, approached Abram and begged of him to return them their servants whom he had made captive, and to take unto himself all the property. So they came to him, give us the servants, you keep the property. Abram answered the kings of Sodom, and saying, as the Lord liveth, who created heaven and earth, and who redeemed my soul from all the affliction, who delivered me this day from my enemies, and gave them into my hand, I will not take anything belonging to you, that you may boast tomorrow, saying, Abraham became rich from our property that he saved. For the Lord my God, in whom I trust, said unto me, thou shalt lack nothing, for I will bless thee in all the works of thine hand. And now therefore, behold, here is all belonging to you. Take it and go. And the Lord liveth, as the Lord liveth, I will not take from you from a living soul down to the shoe tie or thread, accepting the expense of the food of those who went out with me to battle, and also the portion of the men who went with me, Anar, Ashkol, and Mar. They and their men, as well as those who had remained to watch the baggage, they shall take their portion of the spoil. And the kings of Sodom gave Abram according to all that he had said, and they passed him to take whatever he chose, but he would not. And he sent away the king of Sodom and the remainder of their men, and he gave them orders about Lot, and they went to their respective places. And Lot and his brother's son also sent away with his property, and he went into them. And Lot returned to his home to Sodom, and Abram and his people returned to their home, to the plains of Mamre, which is Hebron. And that time the Lot again appeared to Abram in Hebron and said unto him, Do not fear thy reward. Actually, the Lord came to Abram again and said in Hebron, he said, Do not fear, for thy reward is very great with me. For I will not leave thee until I shall have multiplied thee and blessed thee, and made thee thy seed like a star in heaven, which cannot be measured nor numbered. And I will give unto thy seed all these lands that thou seest thine eyes. Then will I give them for an inheritance forever. Only be strong and do not fear. Walk before me and be perfect. And in the 78th year of Abraham's life, in the year Ru died, the son of Peleg, and all the days of Ru was 239 years, and he died. And Sarai, the daughter of Haran, Abram's wife, was still barren in those days. She did not bear Abram either son nor daughter. So it gives us a little more storyline within the book of Yasher. We see that Ru, the son of Peleg, this was one of the sons of Noah that came out from the ark. And I mentioned to you guys in a previous study that when the ark, that was basically the beginning of global warming, because the firmament broke. When the firmament broke, the world changed. And we see that the age of men began to slowly, through the different generation, get lower and lower. So Peleg and Ru, it tells us here that these guys were 209 years, and he died. That was like the last generation where they were living at 200 years. Before that, they were living 500, 700, 900, all kinds of years. But after the breaking of the firmament, after the flood, everything changed. As I mentioned to you guys, that's when I believe the global warming began, because we see the decline in man's age. And it mentioned that these guys were 200 years. Abraham, when he died, I think he was 176. So we see that the last 200-year-old person was around that time. And then in Abram's time, they're now in 100. And then you see them started declining, and the age of man begins to decline. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to Mystery Bible. We're going to stop here for a little while with Abram. We're going to look at this meeting with Melchizedek a little more in depth. We see that he's here. He's 78 years old, and he meets Melchizedek. I have another podcast that I do. It's called Blueprint of Faith. and I do an in-depth study as to Melchizedek in relations to Jesus Christ. Melchizedek is a representation of Jesus Christ. We're going to stop here, and I'll pick up in verse 14, verse 18. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and was the priest of the Most High God. All right, let's stop there for a little while. This is where we see in Christianity where, number one, the tithe is originated from. This is where we see the worship of with the king, and this king Melchizedek, we see is the king of Salem, which is Jerusalem, even before Jerusalem was even a city. And he's a priest of the Most High God. They teach us that he has no lineage, and that he is a representation of Jesus Christ, and that Jesus is our high priest. The Bible tells us that Jesus is now our high priest. When we look in the book of Hebrews, it tells us that as a high priest in the order of Melchizedek, Jesus is referred to. And the Bible says, "Blessed be Abraham." He pronounced this blessing on Abraham. Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, who has delivered thine enemies into thine hands, and he gave him tithes of all. And the king of Sodom, this is when Abram said to the king of Sodom, he says, "No, I don't want any of your stuff." After this, he's having this interaction with Melchizedek. So we see that this is a pivotal part in Christianity, this encounter right here. And I mentioned to you guys that Jesus is considered our high priest, and that's where you see the tithes was instituted, and it is practiced to this day within the church. And we see that also the practice of wine and bread. We see that symbolize the death of Jesus Christ. We see Jesus in his Last Supper talked about the wine and the bread, and it's what it symbolized. And we see that right here as it is spoken of in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and we see that Jesus did the same thing in the New Testament or the Gospels, and he did the same thing. So there's this correlation between the two, and we can see it right here. But we're going to go in Genesis 15, as I mentioned to you, that God comes to Abram and he promises him again. And this is where it gets a little interesting from this point on. But I wanted just to give you that little information as to Melchizedek, that he is the priest without any beginning or end. This is a representation of Jesus Christ breaking his body with the wine and the bread, and also the institution of what we practice today in the church, tithes and offerings. And here we go in verse chapter 15. After these things, the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, "Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield, and thy exceedingly great reward." And Abram said, "Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless? And the steward of my house is this Eleazar of Damascus." Remember, Eleazar was one of the servants that Nimrod had given to Abram as a gift when he had his encounter. And Nimrod, as I mentioned, was one of those kings that came, and he escaped. And he is going to be dealt with later on, because remember, the prophecy that he was afraid of was that Abraham or Abram's seed, or Abram, would be detrimental to his kingdom. And so Esau has an encounter later on with Nimrod. In fact, he actually killed him. So we're going to talk about that later. But anyway, we see that he is saying that all I have here is Eleazar. And Abraham said, Behold to me, thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, This shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowel shall be thine heir. So God had to get a little more specific when he was dealing with him, because again, he's come to him and telling him that your seed is going to be uncountable and all of these things, but he still wasn't getting it. And God had to come and says, wait a minute, let me explain to you what I meant. It's going to be out of your own bowels. And he brought him forth abroad and said, Look now towards heaven and tell the stars, if thou art able to number it. Then he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. And he believed in the Lord, and he, the Lord, counted it to him as righteousness. This is a profound statement within this little encounter here. We're going to come back to it, because this is, I cannot tell you how important this is right here, but we'll be right back to it. And he believed God in the Lord, and the Lord counted it to him for righteousness. And he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees, to give thee this land to inherit it. And he said, Lord God, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? And he said unto him, Take me a heifer of 3 years old, and a she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a pigeon. And he brought them unto him, all these, and divided them into the midst, and laid each pieces one against another, but the bird divided he not. And when the fowl came down upon the carcasses, Abraham drove them away. And when the sun was down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, a horror of great darkness fell upon him. And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge afterwards. Shall they come out of the great substance? They shall come out with great substance, and thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, and thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the 4th generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquities of the Amorites is not yet full. And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. And in the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying unto thy seed I have given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river Euphrates, the Kenites and the Kenzite and the Cadmonites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Rephaims and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Girgashites and the Jebusites. So those sites that we just read, most of these guys are giants, which the children of Israel has to deal with. We see that in the previous verses, when God said to Abram, Know for a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not their heirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. This is the children of Israel in Egypt. And so they were in Egypt. So this was the prophecy that God had given to Abram. He says, your seed will be in Egypt, in a nation for 400 years. They're going to be servants. They shall serve, and when I judge, and afterwards they shall come out with great substance. And if you remember the story with no, not Noah, when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, that they came out with all their wealth because God had told them that to go and ask their neighbors for their jewelry and all of that information. And so, if you remember, when they went and they got all of that stuff when they left, so they left with all their wealth. So this was a prophecy dealing with the Egyptian people before Egypt was even existed. If you guys go to my site, Blueprint of Faith, you'll see my take about what I believe prophecy is. And I'm still looking at it that way because Paul in the island of Patmos came into our timeline. I believe he was brought into our timeline, saw the decisions that we made as a collective, and he was able to then put pen to paper, write it down in the imagery that God wanted him to write down. I believe all of these prophets come into our timeline. Isaiah came into our timeline, and he said, by his stripes we were healed. And Jesus got, it tells us that he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. This is before Jesus Christ was even born, guys. So we see that these guys, I believe, are able to come into our timeline, report what they saw, write it down, and so we know that timeline when Jesus, the minute they hit him on his back, we know that the price that was needed to be paid for the healing of mankind was at that specific moment. I'm doing some studies at my other site, Blueprint of Faith, that deals with some of these topics. So you guys can run over there and check it out. It's really some good stuff. So we see here that there's a couple of things that I mentioned to you that I wanted to get back to. And the verse is 15:6, and he believed in the Lord, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. So here, because there's an argument that comes up in the New Testament when Paul was out there dealing with the Christians of the new Christians of the time, the Gentiles and the Jew. The Jew, of course, those are the ones that were after the circumcision. They believed that the people before circumcision are the Gentiles and all this type of stuff. But let me go back and tell you. So right here in the church, there was a big argument within the New Testament church about righteousness. When Paul went to witness to the Gentiles, when he came to preach the gospel, they were saying that these Gentiles are they aren't circumcised, and that they are not worthy of this. And Paul had to bring them back to that specific word. And he said, Abraham was not righteous after the circumcision. He was declared righteous before the circumcision. The circumcision that he had was a covenant to prove that he was righteous. And so God, it was just a symbol. The circumcision is a symbol or a covenant that he came in with God, showing that he is righteous. So that destroyed the argument that the church had, because the Bible shows us right here that Abraham was righteous. And I'm going to go into this little piece. I think what I'm going to do is make this one of my study, my sidebar. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pick this up next week, and I'm going to do this piece right here, a little sidebar in the first half of of the teaching, and then we're going to go continue about his life. But I want to thank you guys for coming. He's here, he's 78, and we are going to pick up after this. And we see that he got the prophecy about about what's going to happen to his seed, that they're going to be oppressed by this nation, and that is Egypt before Egypt was even Egypt. And so that nation, we know they came out wealthy, as we are going to study that later on and pick up as we go through the Bible. But thank you, and I will see you guys. I thank those people that are supporting us, and I do appreciate it because, as I mentioned, I buy a lot of books and try and get as much information to make sure that I'm giving you guys the correct stuff, and that it's not something of my opinion, but I wanted to give you a fuller picture of what's happening around the scenes at the time, so that you and I can better understand the Bible and what God wants to us and how He rescued. These are men and women just like you and I. They believe God, just like you and I are commissioned to believe God. And as we believe God, we will do great things just like these men, because Jesus said, greater things shall you do than what I did. So you and I are called to greatness, and I want to thank you guys for supporting us here at Mystery Bible.
Thank you for listening to Mystery Bible. Let's walk through the Bible and learn of God and His beautiful mercies and all that He has provided for us, that we may become effective for His kingdom and change this world. Check in every week for a new episode. Search for Mystery Bible on Anchor FM, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Castbox, Breaker, Outcasts, Radio Public, and many more.